I want to talk for just a few more minutes a little bit broader, and not just about Medicaid, but also about entitlements in general in this state. If you look at that chart, it shows a similar trend in terms of the impact of people who are on and the impact of food shares, which is the food stamp program. So you see more and more and more people increasing the number of food stamp recipients that we have in the state of Wisconsin. So what's our suggestion? Well, it's simple. It's another number out there. You may have heard a little bit about this because as we talked about workforce development, and you may have heard over the weekend I talked about a $100 million investment we're looking to make in workforce development, everything from workforce grants to a new labor management information system, which would help us get real-time data so we can adapt to the needs that you all have as employers and work with our technical colleges and our workforce investment boards and others. We talked about programs in our technical colleges, in our four-year campuses with our UW Flex Option program. We even talked the other day about, in rural parts of the state in particular, working with our 2 medical schools and expanding the opportunity for medical students to be trained in our rural parts of the state of Wisconsin, where we can address the need that we have in rural and impoverished areas in the state. All those things we listed, but one of the things that got the most attention was the fact that I proposed $16.9 million more in state aid and additional federal aid that comes with that to change something. You see, a lot of people don't know this, but the federal government has a requirement that able-bodied adults, that's people who aren't seniors, they aren't people with developmental or physical disabilities, they aren't kids, they aren't enrolled in education programs right now, but able-bodied adults, childless adults, who are collecting food stamps right now have to either work or get some work training. But over the years, Wisconsin's been one of the 46 states that asked for a waiver. Well, I notified the government at the federal level at the end of last year that we weren't going to ask for that waiver anymore. And instead, I put in this budget $16.9 million to establish a training program so that for 75,878 food share recipients who are childless adults who aren't enrolled already in an education program to prepare them for a job, if they want to get food stamps in the future, they have to be getting job-ready training. Now, when I get out of Madison, it really doesn't sound like a radical concept, does it? I mean, it's simple, and it goes back to my point about I don't want to kick people out to the street, but I think, you know, my dad was a preacher, so sometimes I think back to biblical references. I always try to think of, you know, the idea, you teach someone to fish, you don't just give them fish. You teach them to grow, you don't just give them food. Well, in our case, it just seems ridiculous to me that we're just handing out food stamps without any expectation. Not only in terms of work or preparation for work, but because our goal should be, if you are able-bodied and a childless adult in this state, we should be providing you a temporary hand up until you can find a spot where your talents can plug into a job in the state, and we should make sure we're so committed to that. We care so deeply about you in the state, and I mean this in all earnestness. We care so deeply about those individuals who right now are suffering from unemployment or other options out there, that we're going to give you the training you need so that when a job opportunity becomes available, you've got the skills needed to step right up and take that job on. That's not just good for the taxpayers. That's not just good for the community. Most importantly, that's for the person who's the recipient of that food stamp right now, because more than anything, better than a food stamp recipient, we're giving, or a food stamp to that recipient, we're giving them dignity. We're giving them the right and the opportunity to get the skills needed to get a job and get back up on their feet again. And so we've got for 75,870, I'm not going to quiz you on all these numbers at the end. I might on the 224,580, but for food stamps. And then the other category I want to talk about is unemployment. Because I've heard about unemployment from a lot of folks here and other small business owners in particular around the state about the frustrations with unemployment. You can see the numbers there, but what really you need to key off is that number at the bottom. So there's all sorts of exemptions and things like that tie in not just to the state but the federal government. But in the end, there's a whole group of people who right now are getting unemployment compensation, we're getting unemployment checks, who have to go out and twice a week have to look for a job. Twice a week. Now, any of you who tuned in and watched me at the State of the State know that I held up a document that we spent the last year working with small businesses all across the state. We listened. We didn't just talk. We listened, and we put together a document that identified more than 300 changes to more than 218 administrative codes that we found were things that either got in the way, they were outdated, antiquated, or just didn't make any sense, and we either were repealing or fundamentally changing, and this is one of them. So next slide shows, instead of saying twice a week, we want you to go out 4 or more times a week to find a job. Now, I had to laugh when I first talked about this. I got some pushback from a couple people in the media who said, oh, the governor's trying to make it harder to get unemployment. And I thought, okay, I'm going from 2 to 4, and a little voice in my head reminded me of what my parents would say when I was a kid if I was looking for work, and they'd say, you need to be out 5 days a week if you're without a job because you should be working every day there's a store or a factory or business open trying to find work. And so all we're doing is saying 4 times out of every week, you should be looking for work. Now again, I'm all for helping people who are in tough times. It's why I was willing to give a little extension in terms of unemployment benefits, because I know in certain parts of our state in particular, we're real challenged, or have been over the last few years, when it comes to finding job openings. But just giving people a hand up should not be an excuse to make that a permanent handout. And this is another example. Whether it's with food stamps, getting the training you need to get prepared for a job, or it's saying if you want to get help in terms of unemployment compensation, we want to make sure you're out hustling each and every week as much as reasonably as possible to go out and find that job. We're going to give you the skills and the backing and the opportunity to do that, but you got to work to make that happen as well. I don't think that's an unrealistic expectation. And so the next one up here just shows just a summary. You see on Medicaid, on food share, which is the food stamp program, and unemployment, that's the number of people. And you saw by those earlier slides, those numbers continue to go up. The only thing that's going down a bit is unemployment, because thankfully, with the help of a lot of private sector employers here and across the state, we've seen our unemployment rates go down over the last 2 years. But there's still challenges in terms of people who are chronically unemployed and what we need to do to break that cycle as well. But the next slide up shows, for us, the answer is simple. It's bold entitlement reform. It's what we're really talking about here today. And again, I know oftentimes in the past I've done this long litany of everything from the streamline the regulatory process so we enforce is about common sense, to lowering the tax burden, which we'll talk about next week in terms of individual taxes and what it means for both as personal taxpayers and as ultimately as small businesses, the vast majority of whom pay the individual, not corporate tax in the state. We've talked about lawsuit reform, and we've talked about all sorts of other things out there that helped us create a better business environment in the state. You just saw me in this last week rolling out our workforce development initiatives, many of which we work with the WMC and other chambers and groups on across the state. You've heard us, you'll be hearing in the near future about our investments in education and driving it based on performance, both in higher education and our K-12 opportunities. Those things will be laid out in the coming days. But today I thought it was fundamentally important to be talking about bold entitlement reform. Because for us to be able to continue to invest in the things that are important, in terms of creating jobs, developing the workforce, investing in our kids and our education, caring for those who are truly needy. I mean, when you think about programs like Medicaid, what's it there for? It's the care for people who truly are living in poverty, either on a long-term basis because of age or an ailment or a physical or a developmental disability, or because temporarily they're in a tough spot and we can help them get out of it. But it should not be a permanent way of life. And our goal in government should not be how many more people can we get on these programs. Our goal in government should be just the opposite. How many more people can we get off of them because we've empowered them to control their own lives, control their own destiny, and move themselves and their families forward. That's what we should be doing in government. And so for this, I just reiterate, these are the reforms we're talking about. Now, we're not limited to this, but these are the big, bold things we're talking about. In food stamps, providing or requiring people who are able-bodied childless adults to go out and get the job training they need, so when a job's open, they're ready to go into that, so we're not making it a permanent cycle. Going on unemployment from 2 weeks to 4, or from 2 times a week, I should say, to 4 times or more a week searching for jobs. And then finally, when it comes to health care, reducing the number of uninsured in this state at the same time we reduce the number of people who are dependent on the government for their health insurance, for their health care coverage. Those are the things we're talking about in this budget. Those are the sorts of reforms that certainly have a budgetary impact in the sense that if we do these successfully, 2 years from now, we'll be able to talk about even greater investments in education and higher ed and workforce development and lowering our tax burden, for which my income tax cut is just a down payment on future cuts and to move our economy forward and put more money back in the hands of our people and our employers. But we'll be able to do those things because we'll have focused our resources when it comes to social services on the people who have the greatest need, on the people who, without our assistance, would not be able to get by in today's society. And instead of adding these ever-increasing numbers, I mean, think about it. How many of you here remember back when you were a kid? It's not a trick question, but how many of you remember when you were a kid growing up dreaming of someday, if you were lucky, being dependent on the government? Right? I mean, how many of you who came recently maybe from another country or have some family members or know some friends or just think back a couple generations to when your grandparents or your great-grandparents came from another country? I mean, I think back, it's many, many generations ago for me, for my family that came on my father's side from places like Ireland and Wales and Scotland. My mom's side of the family from Germany. My wife's family came from Italy and Slovakia. My brothers-in-laws, just 2 generations ago, came from Mexico. I think back in every one of those cases, I don't recall hearing stories about people leaving their home country, in some cases leaving their family and friends to come to America with the dream of someday being dependent on the government. Instead, they came with a dream that if they worked hard, if their kids got a good education, they could live a better life, and more important, their kids and their grandkids and future generations would live better lives than they ever dreamed of. That's what the American dream is. Nobody grows up in America, nobody comes to this country saying, someday, I'd like to be dependent on the government. And yet so many people in Washington seem to push us at the state level and state governments to try and say that the only way we can be successful is somehow if we broaden the number of programs that we provide and encompass more people. And they put all these financial incentives to somehow entice us into thinking that maybe that's a good thing in the short term. And despite the fact that with a $16.5 trillion budget deficit or debt, it's pretty hard to imagine that they have the money to keep those commitments. But even if they did, set aside the money for a minute and think from a moral standpoint. Are we really doing the people of the state a service if we continue to build a series of programs whose overwhelming purpose is to add more people to that system? I think the moral claim here is that we want people to succeed. That's why I'd end with this simple, the 2 phrases. This was self-reliance, but go one more slide forward. Independence. To me, this debate, this discussion, this battle we'll have yet again in this next budget is simply about going from where we started with the first slide that said dependence to where I think most of us in this room, most of us in the state, most of us in the country would prefer to head to, and that's to independence. 2 years ago when I took the oath of office on January 3rd of 2011, one of the phrases I invoked in that speech where I stood right in front of our state's constitution, and you've heard me, many of you have heard me say this before, I literally moved the wing around from where the governor normally has the oath of office administered so that I could stand in front of our state's constitution. Many parts have been debated and discussed in the past, but there's one part, often referred to as the frugality clause, that's never been altered, never been amended. The reason I did that was it was important to remember then. It's been important to remember that every day since then. It's even more important as we move forward to remember the words I said that day, which was simply this: moderation and frugality in government lead to freedom and prosperity for all our people. Now, my staff could tell me I can be as wonky as this all the time. So I know a lot of people were shocked I brought a PowerPoint, but I thought it was important to see those numbers graphically, to see the trends and where things are going. Because, sometimes we lose sight of it because we just kind of take it for granted this is happening. It's like the old analogy that a frog, You can't get out of a pot that's slowly boiling because it adjusts to the temperature so much so at the point when it's boiling, it doesn't know enough to jump out. We're at a point where we're boiling. We're at a point where we need to decide where we want to go. Certainly, there are budgetary and fiscal implications that are significant, and those have to be addressed as part of this budget. But I think the bigger issue isn't just about where our dollars go. It's about how do we view our role in society. I think in the end, when I thought about those words I shared 2 years ago, what I want is a state where my kids can grow up, where Matt and Alex, one who's a senior in high school and the other is a freshman in college, can grow up in a state and a country at least as great as the one that I grew up in. I know when I grew up, one of the great strengths was having parents in a community that instilled in me the values of hard work, self-determination, of dedication and commitment. And I think, unfortunately, those are slipping away, not so much because of society as a whole, but because in too many ways the government, at both the federal and the state level, is stepping in and taking those critical choices away from us. Some will portray this as not caring about people. I think it's just the opposite. I care too much about the people of this state not to empower them to control their own destiny. I care too much about their future, and I think you do too. And I think most people, you sit down over a breakfast table with a cup of coffee and a piece of toast, most people had the time to talk about it. Most people understand. Even for those people today who are on food stamps or unemployed, looking for work, I would argue the vast majority of the people who in this state who are temporarily without employment would tell you that what they want more than anything is the chance to have a job again. They want the chance to step up and take on that job, take on that opportunity, take care of their own family. Those are the people who are truly courageous. It's not people who engage in political battles. It's the moms and dads, just like Tonette and I, all across the state, who every day go to work hard, and those who envision a time when they could do it themselves, who work hard, not just to put food on the table, not just to put clothes in the backs of our kids, not just to pay off the mortgage each month, but more importantly, because we dream big of our kids and our grandkids having an even bigger life than we did, even better life than we did, not just in our homes, but in our communities and our state as a whole. We need to empower every person and every family to have that opportunity in this state. With our reforms, we can do exactly that, and I ask for your help. Not just to share that with the 132 members of this state legislature, but to share it with people all across the state. Because there are going to be plenty of voices out there trying to tell you it's something other than it is. But I think the truth is clear. And the truth is we stand for greater independence, for greater freedom and greater prosperity, and that's the greatest gift the government can give back to the people who duly respect it and own it in the first place. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here today. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.